consciousness is. It is the subjective awareness of an internal or external event. And a key idea here is that it's subjective, meaning it's internal, it's private, it's something happening in your head. Because it is subjective, it is really easy for you to know that you are conscious. And it is really easy for you to know what you are conscious of. But because it is subjective, it is really hard for you to know who else is conscious or what else is conscious. How could you know what the person next to you is conscious of? Consciousness is this internal subjective state, so how could you ever know the contents of someone else's consciousness? Could a man ever know what it is like to be a woman? Could a woman ever know what it is like to be a man? Could a child know what it is like to be an adult? Can an adult know what it is like to be a newborn? Can a blind person ever know what it is really like to see the color red? Or to experience another visual phenomenon? Can a blind person ever know what that experience is like? Can we ever know what it is like to be a bat? What does the bat experience? Can we ever understand what that experience is like? I'm going to show you a video, and when the video is over, I want you to write down a description of what you saw. All right, take a minute and jot down a description of what just occurred. All right, stop there. How many of you use words like afraid, or wanted, or desired, or words that describe intentions or emotions? Raise your hand if you used one of these words. Yeah, so when people see this, they can't help but see it in terms of intentional agents, in terms of the emotions, desires, and intentions that they perceive on the screen. And in fact, if I asked you to write a description of this without using any of those words, you would find it very difficult. Yet these are terms that we tend to reserve for conscious entities. And I'm sure no one perceives these shapes as having consciousness. So how do we know if something is conscious? How would we determine what is conscious and what is not conscious? Let me give you another example. Certain flowers, such as these snow buttercups, track the sun. When the sun first comes up, they orient towards the sun, and then as the sun moves across the sky, they track its motion and are constantly changing their orientation so that they're oriented right at the sun. Would you say that these flowers are conscious of the sun's position? Probably not. You don't tend to attribute consciousness to plants, yet their behavior looks as if they know where the sun is, that they are aware of the sun's position. This demonstrates that being able to respond to an external event is not sufficient for consciousness. Being able to respond to an external event is not sufficient for consciousness. You can be able to respond to something without being conscious of it. Conversely, you can still be conscious even if you can't respond. So being responsive to an external event is not necessary for consciousness either. Take the case of Jean-Dominique Bauby. He's a Frenchman who was the editor of the magazine Elle. And one day he suffered a stroke that left him completely paralyzed. He couldn't move his legs, he couldn't move his arms, couldn't move his torso, he couldn't even move his lips, so he couldn't swallow or talk. The only thing he had a little bit of control over was his left eye, but not his right eye. So the nurses had to constantly put drops in his eyes in order to keep them moist. Well, the doctors assumed that he was in a coma, that because his brain was because his body was unresponsive, that his mind was unresponsive as well. They assumed that he was unconscious. Months later, they discovered that he was completely conscious. Jean-Dominique has a syndrome known as locked-in syndrome. And in locked-in syndrome, you're essentially locked into your body. Your mind is completely functional. You're conscious of everything around you, yet you have no way to respond because you cannot control your body. So how did they discover that he was conscious? Well, one day, a nurse asked him a question. She asked him if he was thirsty. And she said, Jean-Dominique, are you thirsty? Do you want a glass of water? If you want a glass of water, blink your left eye. And he blinked it. And suddenly, this patient, who they assumed was unconscious, was responding, was conscious, had been aware of everything going on around him. Turned out he was really angry. He was very, very angry because people had treated him like he wasn't conscious. And yet he was fully conscious of everything going around. But once they discovered that they could communicate with him through the movements of his left eye, that opened a whole new world to him. And he was able to express himself. And they came up with a method for allowing him to write. And in doing so, he wrote his memoirs. He wrote about his experience in this book called The Diving Bell and the Butterfly. And the title describes his experience. His body was the diving bell. It was completely immovable and uncontrollable, where his mind or his imagination was the butterfly, free to roam around wherever it wished. The way that Jean-Dominique wrote this book was that an assistant stood there with the alphabet and pointed to the first letter, and then the second, and then the third, and kept doing this until he blinked his eye. And then when he blinked his eye, she would write down that letter and start over. And go to the next letter, and the next letter, until he blinked his eye again, and then wrote down that letter. And that is how he wrote this entire book. It's a short book. It's a short book. But he did write this entire book with that method, in which he described what it's like to be someone who is conscious, but no one else knows that you're conscious. So Jean-Dominique is a clear case of someone who is conscious, yet is unable to respond. And until they discover the left eye's ability to respond to questions, was completely incapable of moving his body and responding. So being unresponsive does not mean that someone's unconscious. Let's take another example. There was a woman who is in a coma. And according to medical definitions, someone who is in a coma is unconscious. No doubt about it. If you're in a coma and you're unresponsive to any external stimuli, you're considered to be unconscious. But then these researchers came along and did a study that made people question the medical definition. First, they took a bunch of normal subjects, normal controls, healthy controls, people who were not in a coma, and they gave them certain tasks to perform. One of the tasks was to imagine playing tennis. It was a tennis imagery task. Another task was a spatial navigation task, where they were instructed to imagine navigating through their local town. And when they gave them these instructions, the experimenters scanned the participants' brains. And they found that different areas of the brain were activated when they imagined playing tennis and when they did the spatial navigation task. So we know which areas of the brain are involved in imagining playing tennis and which areas of the brain are involved in a spatial navigation task. Then they took the coma patient and they put the coma patient in the magnet. And they instructed her to imagine playing tennis. And they don't know if she heard them. They don't know if she did the task, but they scanned her brain anyway. And what they found was that the coma patient's brain showed the exact same areas of activity as the awake conscious controls. So that's what this image shows. The top two scans are of the patient. On the left, the patient is doing the tennis imagery task, and on the right is a spatial navigation task. And the bottom two images are of healthy, awake controls. And you can see that the exact same areas in the brain are active. So if the brain is responding to these instructions, and the brain is performing this task, is the person really unconscious? How do you know? How do you know who is conscious and who is not? Let's take another example. Are animals conscious? Animals respond to external stimuli. They can learn. They can even learn complex tasks. Sometimes they demonstrate something that looks a lot like intelligence. Not my dog, but some dogs do this. Are they conscious? And here it seems like the answer is kind of yes and kind of no. That maybe they're conscious of some things, but that they probably don't have the same kind of consciousness that we have. And in this case, it might help to distinguish between different kinds of consciousness. We're going to talk about 4 kinds of consciousness. The first is awareness of sensory qualities. So you can be aware of red, or aware of a particular smell or a particular sensation. Philosophers term this type of consciousness qualia. A second type of consciousness is awareness of external objects, of external things. So you could be aware that this is a rose. These two types of consciousness are related. In fact, the awareness of an external object diminishes your awareness of the sensory qualities. So the second type of consciousness affects the first type of consciousness. When you're not aware of what the object is, the awareness of the sensory qualities are enhanced. And as soon as you know what that object is, as soon as you have an awareness of that object, the awareness of the sensory qualities diminish. And you can experience this, for those of you who wear glasses or contacts, if you wake up in an unfamiliar room, which might or might not happen in college. Before you know where you are and what's around you, the colors seem brighter. The smells seem stronger. But then as soon as you put things into focus and I can identify what you're looking at, sometimes your sensation of these colors fades. and something doesn't look as pretty blue or as bright. A third type of awareness is of bodily states. For example, the awareness of a prick in your skin, or a soreness in your muscles, or awareness of the position of your left arm, or the position of your back. These are all examples of our awareness of bodily states. And before I mentioned it, you probably were not aware of the position of your back. Yet, if you wanted to, and as soon as I said it, you probably directed your awareness to your back. So you're able to focus on your bodily states whenever you want. You have control over this awareness. And the fourth type of awareness is the awareness of internal states, such as the desire to see someone, or when you hear inner voices. And so here are 4 examples of different kinds of consciousness. And we may want to attribute some of these kinds of consciousness to some entities, but not to others. I have all of these experiences, so I attribute to myself consciousness and all these different kinds of consciousness. I assume that you also have all of these types of consciousness. But what about animals? Do animals have inner voices? How would you know? How could you possibly know if an animal had an inner voice? If your dog had an inner voice saying, chew on that sock. That sock would be so great, just chew on it. How would you know this? Let's return to the idea of qualia. So you may ask somebody, what do you see? What do you experience? In this example, we have a patch of red, and we show the patch of red to 2 participants and ask them what they see. And they both will probably say red. But how do you know that their experience is the same? One person may see a slightly darker red, a slightly darker shade of red than the other person. But they have learned that the label for this particular experience is red. Parents sit down with their kids and they point at colorful things and say, what color is this? Yes, it's red. If the kid said, that's blue, they would say, no, that is red. So you learn that a particular experience has a particular label. And in this case, whatever you see there, that experience has the label red. So that's what you would say. Let's take a hypothetical case where the brain was completely rewired, so that when you saw red, you had the experience of the exact opposite color, green. Well, if you ask this person who's been completely rewired, what do you see? They're probably going to say red. Because again, they've learned that the label for that experience is red. This is more common than you may think. And there is a phenomenon known as synesthesia, in which people have very different subjective experiences than people that don't have synesthesia. If you show someone with synesthesia the word synesthesia written in black, some of them will see it the way you see this word. Synesthetes have a special pairing between different sensations. Various sensations are paired together in ways that don't happen for people without synesthesia. And the most common form of synesthesia is the pairing between letters and numbers and colors. So a synesthete may always see S's as being purple, or 9s as being red. You show them a black S and you ask them what color it is, they see it as purple. Here is a quote from someone who has this kind of synesthesia. Until one day I said to my father, I realized that to make an R, all I had to do was first write a P and draw a line from its loop. And I was so surprised that I could turn a yellow letter into an orange letter just by drawing a line. If your sister said this to you, how would you react? Right? It's bizarre. How could P's look like they're yellow and R's look like they're orange? Here's another example of a different kind of synesthesia. T's are generally crabbed, ungenerous creatures. U is a soulless sort of thing. 4 is honest, but 3 I cannot trust. 9 is dark, a gentleman, tall and graceful, but political under his suavity. For this person, letters and numbers are paired with emotions and feelings and descriptions. When they see 4, they can't help but think of something honest. They have this experience that this is something they can trust. Bizarre. Here's another example. Whenever I hear, read, or articulate inner speech, words or word sounds, I experience an immediate and involuntary taste sensation on my tongue. These very specific taste associations never change and have remained the same for as long as I can remember. When this person hears sounds, they taste something. They have taste sensations for every word and every sound that they hear. Can you imagine tasting this lecture? Very strange. The man who tasted shapes can be read about in this book. Another pairing is a pairing of someone who, when they feel touch, they see colors. And this is an artistic representation of what their experience was during an acupuncture treatment. The Russian novelist Vladimir Nabokov is also a synesthete. When he was young, he had an alphabet that had different colors, and he used to complain to his mother that the colors were all wrong. What would you do if someone said this to you? Right? You'd look at them pretty funny. You'd say, lay off the drugs. Synesthesia is involuntary and automatic. They cannot control it. It happens all the time, and it cannot be controlled. The specific relationship that they experience is stable and long-lasting. The scientific study of synesthesia is relatively new, and when people first came out saying these things, the scientists didn't believe them. They thought they were making it up to get fame or fortune. They didn't believe them, and so they were shocked to learn that whatever pairing the person reported at one point was the exact same pairing that they reported 10 years later. If you were making something up, and then someone asked you 10 years later, what was the pairing? It might have been hard to remember every single pairing, every single combination of letters and colors. Yet they were able to do that because to them the experience was real, the phenomenon was real, and it was long-lasting. Synesthetes are often surprised to learn that others do not have the same experience. Just like we're surprised to learn that they have this experience, they're surprised to learn that not everyone sees S's as purple. Right? How do you know? How do you know that the way that you experience the world is the same way that other people experience the world? How can you know? But you can imagine what happened to the synesthetes when they first started expressing the way they saw the world. Typically, they're ridiculed, made fun of, or corrected. Authority figures tell them that they're wrong. No, this is really black. As a result, they tend to keep their experiences hidden and private. And because consciousness is subjective, there's no way for anyone to know what you're thinking about or what you experience, what you see. So you can keep it private and hidden. Synesthesia may be as prevalent as 1 in 30 people. Seems to be more apparent in women. One study found that 1 in 8 women experience this, and another study found 1 in 3 women. I think this is probably a liberal estimate, and there's not quite this many. But it is more common than you may think. It seems to be more common in left-handed people. And there seems to be a genetic component to it. So I'm going to show you and also read to you a passage from a woman who experiences synesthesia and whose dad also experiences it. I came back from college on a semester break and was sitting with my family around the dinner table. And I don't know why I said it, but I said, the number 5 is yellow. There was a pause, and my father said, no, it's yellow ochre. And my mother and my brother looked at us like, this is a new game. Would you care to share the rules with us? And I was dumbfounded. So I thought, well, at that time in my life, I was having trouble deciding whether the number 2 was green and the number 6 was blue, or just the other way around. And I said to my father, is the number 2 green? And he said, yes, definitely, it's green. And then he took a long look at my mother and my brother and became very quiet. 30 years after that, he came to my loft in Manhattan and he said, you know, the number 4 is red and the number 0 is white. And, he said, the number 9 is green. And Carol responded, well, I agree with you about the 4 and the 0, but 9 is definitely not green. Synesthetes can have these conversations with each other because they have the same experiences. But of course, they could not have these conversations with the brother and the mother because they don't know what they're talking about. So, like I mentioned before, scientists are concerned with the issue, is synesthesia real? Is it a real phenomenon, or are people just making this up? And it's hard to believe that it's a real phenomenon, because how could anyone see these letters as having colors? They're clearly black. And so they've been developing tests in order to examine if the phenomenon is real. And I'm going to show you an example test. And I want you to count the number of 2's in the display. And when you have found all the 2's, just raise your hand. All right, so about now is when I'm seeing a lot of hands go up. How many 2's are there? 6. Yes, exactly. Now, imagine if you saw 5's and 2's as being colorful. The task is much easier. Raise your hand when you find all the 2's. Immediately. Very quickly. Well, if you did not have a real synesthetic experience, you would not have been able to find the 2's as quickly as you did with the second display when you saw the first display. So this is evidence that synesthesia actually is a real phenomenon. And that people, if you want to know more, Here's some books. But yes, it's a real phenomenon, and that people really do have different experiences than each other. The qualia differs from person to person. And that maybe subjective reports of what you see is not the best way to do it. So how do we know what people see? How do we know what sensory qualities they're aware of? What external objects? What bodily states? What inner voices? Consciousness was the original focus in psychology. If you were a psychologist, then your goal was to set out and understand consciousness. What was the nature of consciousness? How did it operate? How did it function? How did it work? And at the time, the primary measure for studying consciousness was subjective reports. You ask someone, what do you see? How do you feel? What do you think? And then record their responses. But then came a time when subjective reports were discounted as being effective scientific methods. For one, subjective reports require that you can respond. And as we saw in the case of Bobby, he couldn't respond, yet he was conscious. Subjective reports also require that you have language. So by definition, it immediately rules out the possibility for animals to be conscious. Does something have to have language to be conscious? I don't think so. But then even within humans and regular people, subjective reports are still not that effective. For one, they tend to be incomplete. A subjective report is not the conscious experience itself, it's the judgment of the conscious experience. And judgments are prone to error. They're prone to biases. Let's say you are uncertain about a certain experience. Well, some people, even though they're uncertain, might be more willing to report that experience. Where other people want to make absolute sure of that experience before they report it. So for these two people, the reports look very different, but their conscious experience could be exactly the same. So subjective reports are prone to bias, they're incomplete, and they're not always stable. People can change their subjective report over time, even when their conscious experience is the same. So next, people try to use psychophysics. We talked about this in the perception chapter, and how the idea here is to map the conscious world onto the physical world. So you change some small element in the physical world, and then measure the change in the conscious world. But consciousness is not the same thing as perception. And while psychophysics is a great tool for measuring perception, it's not as effective of a tool for measuring consciousness. So what else can we measure? This is the key idea. You have to be able to measure something. As a scientist, as a psychologist, you have to be able to quantify the experience. As with any problem, there are multiple ways to approach it. I have 3 different approaches listed here: the structural approach, the functional approach, and the clinical approach. You will find that as you develop as scientists and researchers, you will have a tendency towards one of these approaches. One of these approaches will appeal to you, and that is the way that you will find that you approach whatever problems it is that you want to solve. These approaches are not mutually exclusive, and in fact, for something as complex as consciousness, we're going to benefit from taking all 3 of these approaches. The approaches differ in the kinds of questions they ask, the kinds of questions that they think are important to be answered. And today we're going to talk about the structural approach, and then next time we'll discuss the functional and clinical approaches. So a structural approach is asking the question, how does a system operate? What are the properties of the system? What are the mechanics? And several researchers who have set out to study consciousness using a structural approach have decided to focus on the brain. How does the brain respond? And one of the advantages of this approach is that they have found something that they can measure. You can measure the activity in the brain. So it's a great place to start. This was not always thought to be true. The concept of dualism is that the soul is an immortal and immaterial entity that's trapped inside the body. But unless you believe in dualism, then there have to be neural correlates of consciousness. Neural correlates of consciousness in the brain. And the task is to find these correlates of consciousness. That is, compare the activity in the brain when a person is conscious of some object to when the person is not conscious of the object, to when the person is unconscious of the object. So let's start with an example that you guys are already familiar with, and that's the perception of faces and the perception of houses. So if you remember, in this study, the experimenters showed their participants images of faces and then images of houses. And they measured the activity in the brain. And they found that when the person was viewing faces, the area in the brain that was activated was the FFA. The FFA is an area specialized for seeing faces. And when they showed the participants houses, the PPA was activated. So then, in this study, they did a task known as binocular rivalry, in which they had green images of faces superimposed onto red images of houses. And people wore those red-green glasses that you use for 3D, so that the left eye was only seeing faces, and the right eye was only seeing houses. This task is known as binocular rivalry. Binocular because it involves both eyes, and rivalry because the two eyes are competing for consciousness. When you view an image like this through these glasses, you tend to be aware of only one image at a time. So for some of the time, you're aware of the face, and then you switch and become aware of the house. And then you switch again and become aware of the face. So you're aware of each object individually, rather than a combination like what we see here. And what the researchers found was that when people were aware of the faces, there was activity in FFA, as shown by the green circle down there. So when they were aware of the faces, there was activity in FFA. And when they were aware of the houses, there was not activity in the FFA. So even though the visual information coming to the eyes had not changed, that they were always, the left eye was always seeing the face, it was only when they were aware of the face that there was activity in the FFA. And similarly, it was only when they were aware of the houses that there was activity in the PPA. So Jesse, maybe these areas are responsible for consciousness, at least consciousness of faces and consciousness of houses. Let me give you another example. The case of split brain. With split brain patients, they have a lesion in the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum are the fibers that connect the left side of the brain and the right side of the brain to each other. It is only through the corpus callosum that the two sides of the brain can communicate with each other. This procedure is typically done for people who have severe epilepsy, so that the seizures do not travel across the corpus callosum and affect the other hemisphere. But what's really interesting is after this procedure, they experience a condition known as split brain, where they're only conscious of things on the right. The person is no longer conscious of anything to the left. Their brain is still processing things to the left, but then the right brain has no way to communicate what it sees to the left brain. So they're completely unconscious of it. If you ask the person, what do you see? They'll say a chicken foot. They will not say that they see a snowy scene. If you say, is there a house with snow? No, there's just a chicken foot. If you show them an array of objects and ask them to point to objects that correspond with things in the scene, the right hand will point. In this case, this patient pointed with their right hand to the chicken head. And if you ask the patient, why did you point to the chicken head? He'll respond, because I see a chicken foot. With his left hand, he pointed to the shovel. Now that makes sense to us. He's pointing to the shovel because there's a snowy scene. But he didn't see, he was not aware of the snowy scene. He was unconscious of it. And when the experimenters asked him, why did you point to a shovel? He said, to clean up the chicken poop. He made up a reason. He was not conscious of the snowy scene. So he didn't know why he pointed to the shovel, and he then made up a reason to justify his behavior. Let me give you one final example. And this is in a task known as single-cell recording. They insert electrodes, in this case it was in a human, which is very rare. They insert an electrode in a neuron and record when this neuron fires. And they showed the person millions of images. And they found a neuron that they called the Halle Berry neuron, because it only responded to images of Halle Berry. It responded to pictures of her, cartoon drawings of her. It responded to her dressed up as Catwoman, to her name, but it did not respond to images of other women, of other actresses that have played Catwoman, or images of a cat. So this single neuron is a single neuron responsible for our conscious awareness of Halle Berry. See you guys next time.